I have the pleasure of introducing Wes Wilson tonight. He is a scientist who has both a degree in geological engineering and a Master's of Science degree in water resource management. Wes served in Vietnam, was honorably discharged in 1974, and began work with the EPA in Denver that same year. He retired in 2010. Wes has won a whole bunch of EPA bronze medals in the course of his employment with the EPA, including a medal for participating in a team of experts analyzing the wisdom of building the Two Forks Dam by the Denver Water Board. The work of Wes's team caused the EPA to veto the building of that dam. But Wes is most prominently known because of his response to an EPA study that was released in 2004 in response to residents of the state of Alabama who claimed that their drinking water had been contaminated by a process called hydraulic fracturing. The EPA study concluded that the hydraulic fracturing posed little or no threat to drinking water supplies, and Wes Wilson took note of that and requested whistleblower status and spoke out against that study. In an 18-page letter to the Inspector General of the EPA and also to Congress, Wes wrote that the EPA conclusions were unsupportable. He felt that they had done limited research, which had led them to conclude that this industry needed no further study. The EPA's decisions were subsequently supported by a peer-reviewed panel, but 5 of the 7 panel members appeared to have a conflict of interest and may have even benefited from the EPA's decision not to conduct further study or impose regulatory conditions on this industry. After Wes became a whistleblower on the EPA's faulty report, he was featured in the movie Gasland, and hopefully all of you have seen that. He continues to educate communities nationwide on this subject, and he serves on the board of a grassroots environmental group called Be the Change. Please help me welcome Wes Wilson.
Well, good evening. Probably one thing you want to know, what happened to that whistleblower complaint? The Inspector General of EPA began an investigation. Sent out a couple of people from her Washington, D.C. office, and they started looking into the allegations I made to them and to Congress. But how many remember January '04 when then President Bush said, I'm going to spend my political capital? January '05. And the following August, the U.S. Congress voted to exempt the practice of hydraulic fracking from ever being regulated in the Safe Drinking Water Act. If you leave here with one impression, recall this was a bipartisan supported bill. And then Senator Barack Obama voted for the same exemption. So as a result of the exemption, the Inspector General wrote to me and said, well, it can no longer be against the law. Congress has ruled this practice isn't subject to that law. How many of you have seen the movie Gasland? Well, because of that whistleblower complaint, Josh Fox reached out to me. What I didn't know, I did some other documentaries and certainly talked to a lot of journalists, but I had no idea of Josh Fox's staying power. He's really been an advocate for this particular problem for some 4 years now. And he has a second movie coming out, although he keeps telling me it's 3 or 4 months in the future, but it seems like that's always a moving target. Let me get right into it. I'm going to go through some facts versus myths of this industry, focusing on Colorado, and try to relate that to you in El Paso County. And of course, what sets El Paso County apart, you don't have any modern drilling, not yet, but one well. Just look how the 47,000 wells in Colorado are divided up. It's mainly dominated in one part of the Denver-Julesburg Basin, the Weld County. And El Paso's not on this because there's so few producing wells in El Paso County. The industry has changed what it used to do. The industry, if you go back to my father's day, even back to the 70s, the industry was after oil that was trapped, oil or gas that was trapped. You know, much of the oil that's in the world is a result of organisms dying in the sea and then getting trapped in sediments, getting heated up, and then often that oil and gas will move upwards in the rock strata. And if there's something up there to trap it, it became what the industry was trying to drill towards ever since Titusville, Pennsylvania. The first oil wells here in Colorado were right here in Florence because some of this type of oil was flowing to the surface, so they had to see it. That's all changed. What the industry is after now is what is called unconventional formations. And the word unconventional just comes from the GS term, meaning it's not like the other ones. And in this case, it means the oil is where it formed. They're going after the mother lode. They're going after oil and gas that was in the rock but never left that rock. And the reason this wasn't exploited before is they didn't have these two brilliant techniques, ingenious techniques, of drilling down and out exactly where they want it. I've heard it said that if you had a small farmhouse 10,000 feet underground, this industry could put their drill hole into the front door and out the back door. They know through GPS technology where that horizontal well is going. And they're going into these formations that they had drilled through before, where they would look at the rock, this nice black rock, and say, there's oil in there, but it won't flow. And starting in the late, this century, they combine these technologies of fracking it, that is, opening up holes in their horizontal pipe, putting a complex mixture of chemicals and sand, and breaking the rock. The sand is there, so once they pull out the fracking fluid, that little particle of sand will hold open a fissure and allow that gas and oil to flow to the well. The thing for you to get from this little geologic lesson is they don't miss. They don't miss anymore. Because if you're going after a conventional formation, if you were just off to the side, you'd miss. You got nothing. But they know where these formations are. We see the big play here is called the Niobrara play, and they're getting more oil out of it than gas. And that's why we're seeing so much current drilling north of you moving south. This is what the Niobrara Formation looks like on the map. Notice, at least for this map, El Paso, which one is El Paso? This? Right here. About half of the county. In this, here you can see the current drilling pattern. You see El Paso County skipped almost. We have that huge concentration there in the Denver-Julesburg Basin, not extending much south of Elbert. And then we have this, what's called the Canyon City embayment, geologically, around Fremont, some drilling. Then you skip way down to the Raton Basin. This is kind of what the state looks like now to oil geologists. Before, oil geologists were looking for traps where oil had been heated in and moved up, like the Denver-Julesburg Basin. With this ingenious technology of horizontal drilling and high-volume fracking, they can get oil almost any place where it's been under the sea, where it's not mountains. And in that picture, you can see it goes right up to the mountain range. The resource is there, right up to the mountain range. We don't know where the industry will stop. It really surprised me that a company like Hillcorp would move all the way down here and try wildcat welling this far away from other wells. Typical pattern for this industry, especially if you were doing conventional wells, almost a required pattern, was called, drill out the field. Think of it as, once you found the sweet spot, you didn't go very far away. You'd hit a dry one. But now they've found the mother lode. Now they are getting this unconventional formation, this Niobrara shale, and I think they're likely to get it wherever they drill into it. That's certainly been the pattern further north. And they get quite a bit of money worth of oil. Generally that the price of natural gas, where this industry took off in the Marcellus in Pennsylvania, and the industry produced so much natural gas, the price dropped. And so one would expect much less drilling in the West for natural gas, where the West is not as close as Pennsylvania is to the New York-Boston market. And so gas would always be more efficient, produced closer. And in fact, that's what we've seen here in Colorado. Less drilling of natural gas, but a huge amount of drilling for oil. So much so that the industry is burning off a portion of the natural gas it gets as it goes after the oil. If the industry decides it's not close enough to a pipeline to compress and sell that gas, it'll just get flared and burned off in their greed to get the oil. And their pace. This is what drilling looks like in Garfield County. We'll be talking about Garfield County because it's been in focus of some health studies. Let me talk about some myths. The industry, you've seen a lot of ads that said this has been around since 60 years and it's proven safe. Fracking to some extent in vertical wells was done over that time period, but not this horizontal fracking and not with high volumes of water. So we don't have the scientific investigation of this particular technology. Now, one thing you'll hear from the industry, and the state would agree to this, they do have some bad operators. That things go wrong because somebody left a tank open, a valve open, or somebody spilled something. Sometimes there's even bad wells where they forgot to put in the cement or some other important safety part of the well. I call that bad wells can go bad. We get that. And this, no doubt, is a big issue in Colorado. We see a large part of the spills do affect groundwater, and a large part of the spills that affect groundwater aren't cleaned up. They might clean up the soil where the spill occurs, but not the volatile portion that goes deeper. We also have leaking pits. You're now familiar with that from the incident that occurred here in El Paso County with one of these freshwater ponds blowing out. That would be a particular problem if they had flowback fluids in it. And we'll talk about that. So on that aspect, I think even the industry would agree they have their problems. They have their bad actors. You know, we have some 186 operators in the state of Colorado. It's not all the big ones. But what we don't know yet is whether contamination is systemic, whether it's ubiquitous, where it occurs typically. And the first issue is whether good wells can go bad. This is what EPA is studying on the national level. And the good way to think about that is whether the geology that's supposed to protect that fracking fluid from moving up is adequate. And my general impression here in the Front Range, we're probably blessed with some pretty good geology. There's about 4,000 or 5,000 feet of the Manco Shale in between this Niobrara and the lowermost drinking water sources in the ground. So we do have a good shale separating us here. But generally, that's a geologic question. We don't know if that's true everywhere they're fracking. Look at EPA in Pavilion, Wyoming, where they're finding fracking fluids in the near surface, probably because there wasn't an adequate geologic barrier. But what I'm convinced is absolutely systemic is the air pathway. And this is the one I recommend your community focus on. It's because every well is going to release volatile hydrocarbons, volatile organic compounds. Some of them are polycyclical aromatic hydrocarbons. And all of them other than methane, methane's pretty simple, not particularly toxic itself, but all the ones that are higher, more carbon atoms than that, have some type of health risk. So what kind of sources do we see from the field? We see either these pits that can release their volatile organic compounds, the tanks, when they get high pressure, they're released to the atmosphere, and all the spills we've been talking about. But you realize that the industry wants to get rid of some of these volatile organic compounds. It's in some cases required to burn them, but even when you burn them, you may leave 5% back. So we absolutely know we have this air pathway. And until this year, we had very little scientific evidence on it. And I'll come to that scientific evidence now, that it's a problem. I do want to mention something here about natural gas. Let me go back to natural gas, because the industry's focus nationally has been on producing so much natural gas. In large part, many environmental groups bought off on the position that natural gas would move us towards a safer climate, a better, lower risk to climate change. And that's because they were comparing natural gas to coal. You know, here in Colorado, we have, does anybody know the percentage? I think it's 60 or 70% of the electricity, maybe more, is from coal. You know, most of our electric power is coming from burning coal. And it was known that coal produced a great deal of carbon monoxide. It also produced other adverse things, sulfur dioxides and nitrogen oxides and particulates when it's burned. Natural gas doesn't do that. But in work done by Cornell professors, Dr. Robert Horwath and Tony Angrafia, they simply made a calculation and looked at the natural gas industry and found all the leaks take away the advantage that natural gas has to coal. And the reason is that methane itself traps more effectively than CO2. So it's not even going to be a panacea to reduce the climate effects versus coal. We don't even get that advantage from methane. One of the things the industry would have you believe is that fluid migration is rare. That when they put in these multiple layers of cement and steel, fluids shouldn't move, especially the hydrocarbons that are in the formation. It's just not true. We looked at Canadian research. They found 12% of brand new wells have some kind of leak. I mentioned this work by EPA in Pavilion, Wyoming, where they found benzene, toluene, 2-butyl ethanol in the groundwater from fracking fluids. And then I looked closer at home here at Colorado Oil and Gas, and indeed some 36% of these wells have fluid flow right up past the top pipe. A little personal note about correcting Gasland. When Gasland came out, the Oil and Gas Commission here in the state did an unusual thing. They put out a thing called Correcting Gasland. They were going to tell us about the mistakes in Gasland. Oddly, in the very document they titled that, they confirmed some key scenes from Gasland. Do you remember a scene of just showing somebody's feet? That was Amy Ellsworth's property. She didn't want her name known. But this document said that Amy's Ellsworth domestic well was contaminated by the industry. They did the same thing, a similar thing for Lisa Bracken over on Garfield County. The state says their data shows no groundwater contamination. What the state is doing here is a little bit odd, and they've just reinforced it now yesterday. The Oil and Gas Commission adopted a rule yesterday to require groundwater monitoring next to wells. But where they're going to test it is in somebody else's domestic well. So they're not going to drill a dedicated well and look at that near surface where there might be a spill. They're just going to look at somebody else's domestic well. And as a scientist, we have a lot of problems with that. That well isn't under the control of any government entity. It's under the control of some private homeowner. And what we've seen in the past is if a private homeowner well gets contaminated, the industry is often say he did it. That is the homeowner. I left this one in here. I should skip over for Phil. But the water demands are going to be tremendous. Already the state is using some 13,000 acre feet a year for the total fracking operations in the state. The state's not looking when it makes an estimate whether these wells get refracked. When Phil and I looked at it, and we looked at some expectation of 100,000 wells, new wells in Colorado in the next 20 years, they're going to be using more water than Denver, if that's true. And what sets this industry apart is the water they use doesn't come back to the stream. If you're a city, the water you take out, the city of Colorado Springs, returns it down Fountain Creek. If you're agriculture, you return about a half. Even if you're a Budweiser brewing company, you're washing and everything, about half of the water that comes into your use after treatment gets returned to the stream. Not so with this industry. This industry will take fresh water to mix, and they may reuse some for the next well, but ultimately they're taking this produced water and disposing of it down another deep injection well. It never comes back to the surface. This is some of the data we looked at. The highlight here is just about 43% of the spills. We looked at 1,000 records in Weld County, and 43% of them affected the top groundwater. That is, we know they got affected because they didn't report that they cleaned up as much as they spilled. So the things will say like, we spilled 1,000 gallons and we collected 30. That slide's a little bit busy. Let me take you to a picture. Here is a case of specifically where fracking adversely affected a well in Weld County. The distance was about 1,000 feet apart. You see a drill well to the south. Mr. Anderson has a domestic well in his property, and it showed up with some hydrocarbons in it, particularly toxic toluene. And the state agreed that this was caused by the industry. What happened was the state made this well be shut in and haul water. So you never end up with cleaning up the aquifer. You end up with hauled water. There's a case here in Huerfano County. Petroglyph, a company out of Idaho, was doing some fracking for coal bed methane gas, yet a different kind of formation. It's real shallow. And in November '07, some 30 homes in a rural community outside of La Vida had high methane in the homes. A couple of well pits blew up. State came down, started monitoring. The methane was coming up, through their basements. And the result was that the company had to haul those homes water and get some kind of financial settlement with them. But the company never cleaned up the mess. They just filled in their wells and went back to Idaho. Now, let me come back to this main point I'm making and bring you up to date on the science, because some of the science is very recent. I put this down here as a myth. The industry might say drilling and fracking air emissions are not a public health concern. So would the state of Colorado probably say that. That's not what we're finding. There was a group called the Bucket Brigade, a group of citizens who went out on their own and paid for air monitoring. This is kind of rare, EPA has, and the states have some 20 or 30 years of history of helping people monitor water. But we don't help citizens monitor air. It's becoming more practical. There's new instruments coming out, and it's not that difficult for a well-trained amateur to collect a sample and send it off to the lab. And that's what happened here. They found deadly H2S, hydrogen sulfide, coming off a well pad. The state didn't believe it, went out and did its own check and confirmed that there was harmful concentrations of hydrogen sulfide. NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, did a study in Erie. It has a really cool piece of equipment Phil and I got to go see. It's about something the size of a dishwasher. And it runs continuously around the clock, and the chemicals that come in go through this gas chromatograph, this computerized thing inside, and feeds out the actual concentrations of hosts of chemicals. And guess what they found? They found the people of Erie, Colorado, if you know where that is, that's just straight north of Denver, that their hydrocarbons in their air weren't coming from all our trucks and our cars. They were coming from the gas field. There's a unique signature there. Now, NOAA, as an organization, doesn't really carry that forward and say whether that's healthy or unhealthy. They just stay out of that. They tell you, here's the information I found in the air. But these next two studies dealt with that. The first was done by Lisa McKenzie, the Colorado School of Public Health. Some of the background on her study is infamous, because her group was hired by Garfield County after an Encana big infraction of contaminating groundwater and causing other concerns from the community. Encana got fined by the state, and Garfield County used a portion of its money to do a health study. Well, when the health study started showing up there may be problems, the county commissioners stopped the study. Lisa McKenzie and her cohorts went on with the work and released it last June. And what it shows is that people living near wells have higher cancer rates. And the distance she was looking at was just a half mile. So the people living with a half-mile well had about 60% higher cancer rate and other problems. Dr. Theo Colburn of the Endocrine Disruptor Exchange, how many of you know of Dr. Colburn? We are fortunate enough here in Colorado to believe we have the Rachel Carson of our time. She is well known in this field for understanding how small doses of chronic exposure to hydrocarbons cause adverse health effect through the placenta. And if you haven't, that is in the womb. And if you haven't seen it, Google up her website And she has a beautifully impassioned speech she gives to President Obama and the First Lady, where she's talking from a first-person point of view of having children and expecting that nothing would go through the placenta to hurt the infant. But that turns out not to be the case. And the science is showing that small concentrations, sometimes parts per billion, for chronic exposure of some of these hydrocarbons does cause some of these adverse health effects. And she's just published this paper. She was 0.7 miles away from the drilled fields. And then she's citing what they found compared to the literature and saying this is adverse. And one of the things she found was stunning. She found methylene chloride. And to us experts, we didn't know what was going on. Not me so much, but she was checking with some of her peers. And for instance, the lab called back and says, "What are you doing? It's dangerous. You shouldn't be exposed to methylene chloride." And we didn't know how it was used because it wasn't getting reported as a fracking chemical. You know, last summer, the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission went through a whole round of hearings saying we're going to make, like other states, the industry report after the fact what chemicals they use in fracking. You know, I think the question the public was asking was, what toxic gases are coming off? But they took us literally, I guess, and they only reported on what toxic gases are coming from fracking. Because in this case, the methylene chloride is used as a solvent on the rig to reduce paraffin so the workers don't slip. But because it's used for that purpose, it's not getting reported. Dr. Colburn was the first one to find it in the ambient air. And methylene chloride stands out from some of these other hydrocarbons because it's a man-made chlorinated hydrocarbon that doesn't decay in the environment. Once it's there, it's there. Finally, we have just 2 weeks ago, the Colorado Department of Health put out their own study. And they looked at Erie, Colorado, and Platteville and found many similar concentrations to the previous studies. But CDPHE, looking at EPA's health criteria for ambient air, said it's not a problem. Now, why can these two be so far apart? That's the way your government works. We're very slow on, I work for EPA, so I'll talk about it from EPA's point of view. We're incredibly slow. We're abysmally slow at keeping up with any kind of science on risk. You know, it takes us not only a long time, but it takes the consensus of the science to reach. So we have developed through all this time 5 criteria pollutants. Just 5. The industry is using some 100 different chemicals that it's releasing. And so there's no ambient concentration limit for these chemicals. So that's the discrepancy. The CDPHE, your state government, when it looks at it, says, I can see it doesn't look like a risk because we're not over these criteria pollutants of ozone, particulate matter, NOx, SOx, and VOCs. Dr. Colburn looks at the same information, the very same concentrations, and she goes to the science, which your government doesn't do, and she says it's risky. I believe her. But we haven't caught up with it. And we're not going to unless citizens in Colorado wake up and demand something better from their government. I think in this case, the science is in. We've got these 2 studies. It shows it's unhealthy. We can shoot for 0 emissions. And you're certainly going to see how complex it is for you as a county or a city government to get into the path of the state and see if you can do your own rule. But it's my view that the way this case law is set up, where counties and states can do additional rules as long as it can be found in harmony with the state's requirement to drill, that a county or a city could require 0 air emissions and simply contest that's necessary for our public health, and it still allows drilling. But that would be a legal controversy of great import, as you'll see. Here's some of the data that, in this form that NOAA put out that just shows, one, that the concentrations in the air in Erie for some of these chemicals was high as Houston. Let me get to my last slide here, and it's simply this. The state would have us view that cities and counties are preempted. In fact, Governor Hickenlooper has taken the unusual step of suing Longmont. As far as I know, it's the first time the governor any governor has sued a community. What Longmont did two things. It's important to keep them separate. Longmont made its own very stringent rules. For example, it was doing setbacks from paths within its open spaces. It was doing stringent rules. And that's what the governor sued over. Not being satisfied with these stringent rules, the citizens of Longmont took it upon themselves to do an initiative that passed in November to entirely ban fracking. This gave much high energy to this interest of trying to control the industry. So by a 60-40 vote, Longmont became the first Colorado community to ban fracking. Now that's been litigated too, but not by the state, but by the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, by the industry. With the governor's help. The governor is out there saying, come on industry, you should stop Longmont because, says the governor, the rights to the mineral estate trump the surface owner, and you can't deny the mineral. We don't see it that way. Certainly, the right to protect your public health and zone your community are the essence of what a local government does. And as Sam Schubacher of Food and Water Watch puts it, we're not banning drilling altogether. The gas is still down there under Longmont. We're banning this method of fracking. It's like we're banning dynamiting fishing. And because we are banning fishing by dynamite, you don't get to claim the fish you would have got if you dynamite. And that's what the industry is going to go after. They're going to try to stop this community from protecting its own health and protecting its property rights. You'll see, I'm put down here zero air emissions. I think it's essential we get to zero air emissions. If I had my way, these things would look like a little apartment. The drilling rig should look like a tall apartment. And everything inside of there would be contained. And you'd collect all those gases and either burn them or sell them. I certainly think a community has a right to prevent drilling in its residential zones. Many communities like Commerce City, Denver, are being pressured by the state to withdraw their no industrial activity in residential zones because of what's seen as this preemptive right to drill by the state. And lastly, you get to certainly a community could do air and water monitoring. If you're serious about groundwater monitoring, you would have drilled monitoring wells put in. Don't rely on domestic wells. And air monitoring, you have to get permission from the company. You can't just monitor some distance away. You need to come in close to the well. But it's a reasonable burden and cost that should be on the industry.